Many military enthusiasts believe that there was only one bomber in the United States inventory during World War II. This is untrue, of course, but historians who have written extensively about the conflict in Europe have focused so much attention on the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress that it is frequently assumed to be the only American bomber of the conflict, at least until the Boeing-designed B-29 Superfortress, which is much larger, arrived. Consolidated B-24s. Liberators were actually constructed in significantly greater quantities and saw more widespread usage than B-17, both as bombers and in other capacities. In actuality, the B-17 was only widely used in the 8th Air Force. Thousands more Douglas A-20s, North American B-25s, and Martin B-26, together with superb British bombers like the Lancaster and Wellington, served in every theater of the war, but probably more than any other bomber, the fort has come to represent the air war. Ironically, the B-17 was already out of date when the first Japanese bomb was dropped on Pearl Harbor, and its initial introduction during the war had such poor results that the British, who were the first to test it in combat, chose to import the new consolidated plane instead of the Boeing bomber because it was intended to replace it. Nevertheless, the Flying Fortress's popularity reached mythical heights, mostly due to the press's romanticization of the bomber, which went well beyond its true capabilities and achievements. Even its name is said to have originated with a reporter for a Seattle newspaper who called the new bomber a flying fortress. The young men who flew it in combat contributed to the myth by saying it was the best and safest bomber ever made, despite suffering greater losses than their B-24 counterparts. The Boeing Aircraft Company's B-17, which made its debut in 1935, was not the aircraft the Army Air Corps had in mind for a long-range bomber. Rather, it was built on technology from the 1920s and early 1930s. With an aerodynamically curved wing that allowed for higher speeds and bigger payloads with engines of the same rated horsepower, Consolidated's B-24, which was intended to replace the B-17, was in many ways a much better aircraft. The B-17 was an all-electric aircraft, but the B-24 and almost all subsequent large aircraft had hydraulically operated landing gear, flaps, and other parts that needed much less upkeep than the many electrical servos that controlled the B-17's turrets, landing gear, and flaps. Nevertheless, the B-17 had a design element that allowed it to withstand damage and provide a stable bombing platform. Its massive wing had an exceptionally long chord, the diameter between the leading and trailing edges, which generated a significant amount of lift and had sizable voids that allowed bullets and shrapnel to pass through without causing significant damage. However, the B-17's speed was constrained, and its operational range was drastically diminished by the significant drag generated by that same huge wing. The Boeing 299, the B-17 Flying Fortress prototype, makes its public appearance on July 16, 1935. 3 months later, a crew error caused the plane to crash during an air demonstration. In the latter months of World War II in Europe, when German fighter attacks dwindled and increasingly accurate German anti-aircraft guns posed the main threat to bomber formations, the B-17's ability to climb higher than a Liberator was made possible by the combination of the Clark Y wing and its lighter maximum gross weight. Due to the wing's natural stability and the little control inputs needed to operate the ailerons, the large wing also made flying the aircraft easier. The B-17 resulted indirectly from U.S. Army thinking from the years after the Great War, when Air Service leaders, under the controversial leadership of Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, pushed for a larger, more powerful bomber. General Billy Mitchell started to push for the development of a big bomber with a 10,000-pound payload and a 1,000-mile operating range for night missions. This mission requirement would not be satisfied until the B-29 and consolidated B-32 were introduced in 1942. By the 1930s, engine performance and aerodynamics had significantly improved, and American public policy was shifting toward the use of aviation to protect the North American coasts. Military planners once more searched for a huge bomber because they needed long-range bombers that could intercept and strike an enemy invasion force hundreds of miles out at sea. The new bomber had some positive attributes, such as docile handling abilities that made it popular with young pilots who had received their training in biplanes, even though it lacked the performance the Army was truly looking for in a long-range bomber. The senior leadership of the Air Corps was keen to acquire more of the new B-17 because it provided new capabilities in aerial bombardment, and the officers who flew it were certain that it was the best bomber in the world. The B-17 provided a sturdy bombing platform that enabled bombardiers to deliver their bombs accurately, at least during training, from medium altitudes, and an element within the Air Corps were becoming ardent supporters of the idea of daytime precision bombing. 2 B-17-equipped battle groups were to be formed, one for each coast. The Air Corps had asked for 50 extra aircraft, and another squadron of 13 had been approved. The acquisition of multiple squadrons of massive land-based bombers was perceived as a confrontation with the Navy's carrier-based bomber force, which at the time was comparable to comparable forces worldwide, as military planning in the mid-1930s was focused on homeland defense rather than strategic operations. No nation in 1936 possessed an air or sea force that could directly threaten the United States, and there was no reason to believe that any would in the near future. The trajectory of world events and President Franklin Roosevelt's concentration on strengthening the U.S. military, particularly its air forces, prevented the B-17 from going extinct. War clouds that were gathering over Europe provided a pretext for requesting funding for military programs from Congress. Roosevelt was able to pass legislation authorizing a massive defense budget because his party controlled both the legislative and executive branches of government. The military, which had been severely underfunded, now had the money to recruit men, to equip newly formed combat units, and buy more equipment, especially aircraft. There were only 13 B-17s in stock at the moment, but 40 more were now on order. However, the Army had determined that the B-17 was not the bomber it truly desired. The War Department issued a revised demand for a 4-engine bomber with improved performance to replace the B-17 until a real, long-range bomber could be created because of its limitations in range, speed, and payload. For the new B-24, Consolidated Aircraft was given the contract for the new bomber. This September 1937 photograph shows a group of early model B-17 Flying Fortress bombers flying over the cityscape of Manhattan, an early version B-17 Flying Fortress formation. Despite the B-17's existence since 1935, Boeing and the Army's ambitions to enhance the aircraft's capabilities had, at least in part, constrained production. The output of the Curtiss-Wright engines was subsequently raised to 1,200 takeoff-rated horsepower, and the addition of superchargers enabled later models to operate as high as 35,000 feet at lesser weights. B-17s were first flown in combat by the RAF. War had erupted in Europe by 1940, and the Royal Air Force of Britain was keen to test the new bomber. 20 B-17Cs were diverted from U.S. manufacture under the Lend-Lease Act for delivery to Britain, where they were assigned to No. 90 Squadron RAF and dubbed by the RAF as Fortress 4. The Army Air Corps was keen to learn what the aircraft could achieve in combat situations. The Fortress. I had a poor record. One aircraft had to divert because of engine problems on the first mission, and the guns froze up and were rendered ineffective. One of the bombers was shot up so badly that it could not be put back into service, and the target was unharmed by the second operation. The first delivered Fortress. I ground-looped on landing, ran off the runway, and had to be dismantled for parts, making this the second to be lost. All 3 of the bombers on the operation were lost to fighter attacks during the third combat mission, which was targeting Oslo, Norway. 8 of the 20 aircraft had been lost in battle or accidents in just over a month of operation, and the RAF concluded it no longer wanted to work with the Boeing bomber. The remaining Fortress Is were given to RAF Coastal Command for coastal patrol, while 4 were deployed to North Africa, where they were used only as night bombers. Instead of taking on any more Fortresses, the RAF chose to accept the new consolidated 4-engine bomber, which was already starting to be manufactured as a replacement. The RAF didn't take on any more B-17s until the end of 1942, and their main functions were electronic countermeasures and coastal patrol. Despite using the B-17 as daylight bombers on unaccompanied missions and relying on their own weapons to protect against fighters, the RAF came under heavy fire for the aircraft's combat failure, similar to the U.S., what the Army intended to do in the event of a national conflict. Crew members of the Royal Air Force board a B-17 while conducting missions in England. The British used the B-17 for coastal patrols, but they were dissatisfied with the heavy bomber's overall performance. The shortcomings in the B-17's designs had been identified, and newer models had been created with adjustments that addressed some of the issues first faced by the British, which was fortunate for the young men who fought with the 8th Air Force in England. However, unless appropriate escort fighters were created to follow them to and from their targets, B-17 crews would endure terrible losses. In the Pacific theater, B-17s. The B-17 was initially used in combat by American forces in the Philippines and the Southwest Pacific, despite being most famous for its service with the 8th Air Force in England. As Japanese aggression in the region increased, President Roosevelt concluded that the Philippines could be used as a base from which to defend against further expansion of Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, despite the War Department's initial dismissal of the islands as indefensible under the Rainbow Plan for National Defense. The War Department started increasing military power in the Philippines in the summer of 1941, deploying a sizable heavy bomber force composed of B-17s and B-20 foes. The 19th Bombardment Group was notified of the War Department's decision in August 1941 to relocate the first heavy bombers to Clark Field. By the spring of 1942, the War Department planned to have 165 heavy bombers in all. B-17S would make up about half, with a comparable number of B-24s. The widely believed belief that American forces in the Philippines were unprepared for war has persisted for a long time. A better term would be understrength. General Douglas MacArthur's Philippines Department was frantically preparing for war, expecting it would not break out until after the beginning of the year, by which time the island's military might would have significantly grown. In order to safeguard his troops, the department's top Air Corps official, Lieutenant General Louis H. Brereton, stationed his fighter squadrons at multiple locations around Luzon. He directed 2 of the 4 squadrons of the 19th Bombardment Group to Del Monte Plantation on Mindanao on December 4th, just 4 days before war broke out. Thus, when Japanese bombers hit Clark at noon on December 8th, half of the B-17s in the Philippines were spared. Even so, it is widely considered that the bomber force was not taken by surprise, but rather suffered a misfortune. Following news of the strikes on Hawaii, the 2 squadrons had been put into the air for scouting operations earlier in the day. However, they were summoned back to refuel and rearm in preparation for an afternoon attack on Japanese airfields in Formosa. Sadly, a Japanese formation bombed and strafed Clark Field while both squadrons were still on the ground, and strafing fighters destroyed the whole force save for 3 aircraft. Before they could fly an operational mission, all 3 bombers were destroyed by freak accidents, despite the frantic efforts of maintenance staff to fix the damaged aircraft. Nevertheless, the 2 remaining squadrons would serve as the backbone of the Air Force that would finally defeat the Japanese in the Southwest Pacific, and half of the heavy bomber component in the Philippines remained unaffected. For the following 2 weeks, the 16 B-17s at Del Monte remained in operation in the Philippines until Roosevelt made the decision to leave the islands, at which point the remaining members of the 19th Group were sent to Australia, where they established their base at Bachelor Field, close to Darwin. A number of successful strikes against Japanese ships and landing parties at Vigan were carried out prior to the B-17's departure, although the costs and upkeep involved were high. Captain Colin P. Kelly and his crew flew one of the B-17s that attacked Vigan. Except for Kelly and the co-pilot, who stayed on board, the majority of the crew bailed out over Clark after being assaulted by aircraft. Both pilots were thrown out when the airplane exploded before they could jump. Kelly was killed when his parachute failed to open. He became the first American hero of the war and received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously. In October 1942, a B-17 heavy bomber banks, away from its objective on the Solomon's Pacific island of Gizo. The expanding B-17 force under MacArthur's command was directed to attack Japanese installations in New Britain and the Solomon Islands as part of his orders to defend Australia. When the 7th Bombardment Group was sent to India to establish the bomber command for the new 10th Air Force, the bomber force was diminished, at least on paper. The majority of the aircrew and only 6 aircraft moved to the 19th. After departing Darwin, the 19th Group relocated to Townsville, where it staged aircraft and men for operations against Rabaul, the primary Japanese staging and supply base in the Southwest Pacific, via Port Moresby. As part of a mission, the crews had to leave Townsville and spend the night in Moresby, where the flight crews tried to sleep on the wings of their bombers or on the ground, while the ground crews maintained the aircraft. They would depart early in the morning and travel via the rocky Owen Stanley Mountains before reaching their destination on the Bismarck-Seto. Bombers were often timed to reach over the target before daybreak, and missions were limited, with no more than 3 aircraft. At least the sailors were delivering a blow to Japan, even though the target was likely only slightly damaged. The B-17 had a strong track record in Java, the Solomons, and the Philippines. Crews returned from missions in aircraft that had been heavily damaged by fighter attacks. However, the damage was frequently more superficial than structural. Those B-17s frequently made a comeback, despite being hit repeatedly in the enormous wings and tail, resulting in the legend that the Flying Fortress was more rugged than Liberator, its sister. In reality, both aircraft survived multiple fighter hits and flak shrapnel, and were vulnerable to lethal cannon damage in structural sections. Compared to the B-24's narrow wings and tiny twin vertical stabilizers, the B-17's broad wings and huge tail just provided more surface area, and were therefore more likely to be struck. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney came to Australia in late July 1942 to take over as MacArthur's air commander. In order to prepare for the upcoming invasion on Guadalcanal, he first grounded the entire bomber force for maintenance in preparation for launching a massive attack on Rabaul. On the day of the Guadalcanal landings, the V-Bomber Command was able to get 15 aircraft over Rabaul, even though single aircraft and small formations continued to operate against Japanese shipping at night. Missions were arranged with as many aircraft as possible from that point on. Kenney also made the decision to return the Season 19th Group to the United States shortly after his arrival. Since the previous December 8th, the group had been engaged in continuous action, and its crews were emotionally and physically exhausted. Arriving from the United States, the 43rd Group would take over as the main heavy bomber group in the Southwest Pacific until the 91st Group, armed with B-24s, arrived. The final B-17 unit deployed to the Pacific was the 43rd. Although the B-17 force's days in the Southwest Pacific were coming to an end, they continued to launch low-level nighttime assaults against shipping. The chapter on the B-17's involvement in the Pacific War was closed due to War Department priorities, as well as the B-24's better range and payload. By the end of 1943, every new group entering the theater flew Liberators, and all of the B-17 had been replaced by B-24s. The 8th Air Force's B-17. The B-24 was actually supposed to be the main bomber for the Army Air Forces, but most of its top officers favored the Liberator because of its higher payload, speed, and range. The exceptions were Jimmy Doolittle, who returned from the Tokyo raid to command the new 12th Air Force in North Africa, and the staff of the 8th Air Force, which deployed to England in the summer of 1942. This series of photos shows the B-17, often known as Vicky, going down in the sky over Italy. Vicky releases its bomb load in the first frame. In the second, an engine erupts flames after flak strikes the aircraft. The third shows 2 parachutes opening, though they are hard to see, and the plane disintegrating after a deadly mid-air explosion. The 8th Air Force was originally intended to be the U.S. From bases in England, an Army Air Forces element will fight Germany. By the time it moved overseas in July 1942, the original unit had evolved into a heavy bomber organization, backed by fighter and troop carrier commands. Despite being a conventional air force with a fighter component and a full range of bomber components, heavy, medium, and light. The initial U.S., on August 17, 1942, a dozen B-17s from the 97th Bombardment Group flew a B-17 mission in Europe against the railroad marshalling yards in Rouen, France. The goal of the Rouen mission was to raise awareness that the U.S., in Western Europe, Army air forces were starting combat operations against German targets. The primary goal of the raid was to generate headlines for newspapers. There were no casualties, and the bombers were escorted by Spitfire fighters to and from the target. It was found that the bombing outcomes were quite good. Although American B-17 missions were off to a solid start, particularly when compared to the early British efforts, they faced minimal resistance because they were relatively short missions against targets in France. Before the B-17s were subjected to their first fighter strikes, 6 missions were flown. 2 fortresses were down on the 9th mission, but 3 more flights were flown without any losses. Shipping was suffering greatly as a result of U-boats, and destroying the pens where the submarines took refuge in between raids became a top priority. Submarine pens in northern France were the heavy bombers' primary targets after October. Although the B-17 gunners reported that they were killing a lot of their attackers, post-war examination of German documents shows that these reports were wildly inflated. In the fall of 1942, heavy bomber missions from England were primarily intended to attract media attention. As additional planes and crews arrived, that started to alter. Targets in France and occupied Europe, especially submarine sites around the Bay of Biscay, were the focus of the few winter operations that were conducted. The accompanying Spitfires could only fly a short distance over the English Channel, and the B-17s were not strong enough in numbers to enter Germany unaccompanied. The Casablanca Directive, which was issued by the Combined Chiefs of Staff on January 21, 1943, called for a combined bomber offensive from the United Kingdom. American bombers would attack during the day, while their British counterparts would carry on the night attacks that the RAF had been launching for almost 2 years. Bombers from the 8th Air Force had not yet been seen in the skies over Germany. German anti-aircraft defenses were known to be formidable, as British losses on their night missions demonstrated. The heavy bombers' experiences during the early missions over France showed that they were unable to effectively defend themselves against the hordes of Luftwaffe fighters they could expect to encounter once they began penetrating German airspace. The intricate instrument board of a modern flying fortress reveals the great versatility of the huge American bombing planes, was the original caption for this picture of the flying fortress's cockpit. After beginning operations in Germany in the late winter of 1943, the 8th Air Force soon discovered that they could not be carried out without suffering significant casualties. The losses increased with the depth of an operation into German airspace. At the time, there weren't many American fighters stationed in England, and the Spitfire's 8th Fighter Command had fitted to its squadrons weren't long enough to reach farther than France. The 8th Air Force attempted to turn several B-17 and B-24s into heavily armed escorts due to the absence of a suitable escort fighter. The modified fortresses were designated YB-40s, and they carried a lot of ammo in the bomb bays and had more weapons. Although the idea was appealing in theory, the YB-40SEs were largely ineffectual in real life. They were far slower than the already sluggish bombers due to their heavy armament, which decreased combat speeds and increased the B-17's susceptibility to fighters. The chin turret, which was used in all subsequent B-17 manufacture, was the project's one positive outcome. In the spring of 1943, 8th Fighter Command started obtaining Republic P-47 Thunderbolts to enhance its escort capability. The former Spitfire pilots disliked the P-47s because they were heavy, but they soon showed themselves to be strong fighters that could go much deeper into German-held territory than any other fighter had before, thanks to the installation of external fuel tanks. Nevertheless, the P-47s could only fly a short distance into German sky, even with more fuel. The bomber formations were left to engage an increasing number of Luftwaffe aircraft when the escorts pulled away. This September 1944 photo shows the USAAF 92nd Bomb Group's B-17 flying fortresses releasing their payloads above Magdeburg, Germany. The B-17s suffered enormous casualties in the absence of sufficient escorts. Only when the bombers flew in big formations was the pre-war notion that the bomber will always get through turning out to be accurate. And even then, casualties were significant. In order to replace combat losses and equip B-17 groups that were then in the training pipeline, it was decided that all future B-17 manufacture would be shipped to Europe. Additionally, all but 2 future combat groups would be outfitted with B-20 foes. All 8th Bomber Command Liberators were deployed to Libya in the summer of 1943 to support the invasion of Sicily and conduct the most well-known air raid of the war, the audacious low-level strike on the oil facilities at Ploesti, leaving the B-17s alone in England. 8 Bomber Command experienced the most losses to date on August 17th, the anniversary of the first 8th Air Force B-17 mission. The ball-bearing industries at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg were targeted by a force of 376 B-17s. The two-pronged effort was part of a larger strategy that involved the 8th and 9th Air Force B-24s attacking aircraft plants at Wiener Neustadt in Austria in tandem with the B-17 flights over Germany. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission was delayed for 4 days, while the Wiener Neustadt mission was launched on August 13th. Assigned to the Schweinfurt attack, the 1st Bombardment Wing was scheduled to return to its bases in England. In the first shuttle bombing experiment, the 4th Bombardment Wing's B-17s were fitted with long-range gasoline tanks and were to carry on to North Africa for rest and replenish. 18 squadrons of P-47s and 16 Spitfires were scheduled to serve as escorts because to the anticipated strong fighter opposition. The German fighters entered after the escorts had gone as far as they could. 66 B-17s from the Regensburg force and 24 from the Schweinfurt mission did not return from the operation or make it to the shuttle bases in North Africa. Almost all were attacked by fighters. The cost of continuing unescorted operations into Germany was becoming clear. 8 Bomber Command returned to Schweinfurt on October 14th. The 2nd Air Division B-24s, which were to fly a far longer, more southerly route to the target, joined 291 1st and 3rd Air Division B-17s this time. Thunderstorms over England in the early autumn caused issues for the formation. The formation leader chose to divert the Liberators toward Emden, since the B-24 force was limited by adverse weather, while the B-17s were eventually able to gather. The ploy did not fool the Germans, and as soon as the escort stepped out of the B-17, a swarm of fighters charged at them. It was a worse version of the mission against Schweinfurt. Once more, 17 B-17s returned with significant battle damage, while 60 B-17s and their crews were lost. Following the Schweinfurt mission and subsequent significant losses over the course of 6 days, which resulted in the loss of over 80 more bombers and their 10-man crews, the 8th Air Force made the decision to suspend any further flights into Germany until the escort issue was resolved. The American 381st Bomb Group's Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers fly in a practice formation as summer gives way to fall in wartime England. Photographed in 1944, these bombers are the B-17G version. Some B-17s were fitted with H-2X radar navigation equipment in September 1943, enabling blind bombing by marking bomb release positions with radar. The 8th Bomber Command created a new lead crew system in which formations launched their bombs in time with the lead bombardiers, who blasted visually if possible, but by radar if the target was hidden by clouds. The crews were trained in radar bombing. Radar and synchronized bombing had become standard practice by early 1944, as weather conditions over Europe worsened. Instead of precision bombing, which had been so strongly emphasized prior to the war, and had proven impossible in combat situations, missions were planned using a shotgun method that called for maximum tonnage on the target. 8th Air Force planners had developed a standard that required the maximum number of bombs to fall within a 1,000-foot circle around the target. As more P-38s were made available in England and the P-47's effective range significantly expanded, the escort problem was resolved by the beginning of 1944, Additionally, redesigned North American P-51 Mustangs were starting to be produced, though it wouldn't be until the middle of 1944 that their numbers were sufficiently expanded to make them useful for escort duties. After resolving the escort issue, the bombers made a significant attempt to target aircraft manufacturing facilities in Germany during the final week of February. In concert, formations of the 8th Air Force arrived from England and the 15th Air Force arrived from Italy. In order to prepare for the invasion of Normandy, the objective was to eliminate the Luftwaffe and achieve total air superiority over Western Europe. The energy and transportation sectors were also given top priority, but the main objective was the production of German aircraft. The V-1 and V-2 rocket launching sites in France were the target of another significant endeavor. The heavy bomber mission was basically the same from February 1944 to the conclusion of the war, a calculated effort to demolish German industry. While some missions were directed towards tactical objectives following the assault of Normandy, the strategic campaign persisted. Growing losses to flak as precision increased became a serious problem, as escort fighters were able to hold the Luftwaffe at bay. In order to dodge the flak, bomber formations had to fly higher and higher, and the B-17 and B-24s were equipped with heavier armor. The flying fortresses were able to operate at greater altitudes thanks to the B-17's enormous wing, but as their weight increased with the installation of more and more armor, their airspeed and range decreased. The B-17's primary shortcoming, speed, was lessened by the decrease in fighter strikes, and the Allied advances into Europe and eventually Germany eliminated the need for complex routes to and from the objectives as well as excess range. General Doolittle assumed command of the newly formed 8th Air Force in late 1943. As a well-known air racer prior to the war, Doolittle gained the respect of the senior British officers on the Allied staff during his time as the commander of the 12th Air Force in North Africa. When General Dwight Eisenhower and his staff were ordered to return to England, they pushed for Doolittle to accompany them. Doolittle had an insidious hate for the B-24 and a particular affinity for the B-17. Bomber losses decreased as a result of the cessation of unaccompanied bomber flights into Germany, which also increased the number of B-17s available. In order to transition the entire 8th Bomber Command to the Boeings, Doolittle started converting the B-24 groups in 3rd Air Division to B-17s in the middle of 1944. The B-24s were compelled to operate at lower altitudes as their operational weights grew with heavier armor, making them more susceptible to anti-aircraft fire, according to Doolittle, who justified the planned switch. The approaching conclusion of the war and the decision by headquarters U.S. Army Air Forces to halt B-17 production in order to use the facilities to construct B-29 superfortresses for the air campaign against the Japanese home islands stymied his intentions. However, the matter had become irrelevant by that point. Germany's army had been forced back into the country by Allied ground forces. Strategic bombing was becoming less necessary, and the War Department's focus was now on defeating Japan. The B-17 would not play a combat role in this campaign. The majority of the B-17s went to the scrap heap rather than the Pacific when the European War ended. None of its B-17s would participate in the move of the 8th Air Force to Okinawa, which was decided by the War Department. Instead, it would be outfitted with B-29s and become a second heavy bomber force. Even though the headquarters of the 8th Air Force relocated to Okinawa, the war ended before it could be put into service. Sam McGowan is a Vietnam veteran and retired pilot. He lives in Missouri City, Texas, and has written many books on a variety of World War II-related subjects.